It's been said that you don't get a second chance to make a first impression, and in the case of the original Final Fantasy XIV, well, the first impression wasn't a good one. So much so that Square Enix decided to wipe the slate clean with Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn. The video game equivalent of a mulligan, A Realm Reborn spent 3 years in development in an attempt to right the wrongs of its widely criticized predecessor. The good news is that the reincarnated Final Fantasy XIV creates a much better impression than the first game. You start out in one of 3 regions in the continent of Eorza, a place where I spent countless hours during beta until my precious character vanished into the ether in preparation for the final release. Wait, what? No! After going through the Final Fantasy XIV beta on a PC, I opted to play the final version on the PlayStation 3, which was met with much forehead slapping by my PC gaming buddies. Hey, I'm an all-rounder, baby! Granted, the first week or so of the game definitely had teething issues. In fact, the North American server I created my main character on was always so full that I ended up creating an alt, a tiny little Lalafell that I wanted to turn into a tank in one of the European servers because that was the only way I could play during peak times in the US. The good news is that this issue has pretty much been addressed during the last major server upgrade, so you can game on to your heart's content. So, how does the game look? Overall, I think graphics is definitely a strong point of this game in comparison to other MMOs, especially on the PC. Character models look especially nice compared to rivals such as World of Warcraft, and the game has a nice Final Fantasy feel to it. The only downside of playing the game on the PC version first, of course, is that the PS3 version looks underwhelming in comparison. If your eyeballs haven't been tainted by the PC version's hot looks, however, then the console version is just fine. The game itself starts off slow for most MMO veterans, but things unlock pretty quickly. One thing that A Realm Reborn does especially well is teaching new players how to play through tutorials and missions. Once you reach level 10, for example, you unlock guild hests, which are an excellent way to teach players the basics of fighting as part of a group. Later on, you unlock your first dungeon mission, which teaches the basics of dungeon raiding as well. This makes the game less intimidating for newcomers while still providing enough depth to cater to hardcore MMO players. There's certainly a lot to do in the game, from an abundance of quests and instances to various professions and crafting classes to try your hand at. 4 active time events called Fates. You can even temporarily level down your character in order to join lower level events and earn experience. Crafting, meanwhile, is a unique feature all unto itself that provides a change of pace from other games with its own mechanics. For classes, you can use the same main character for any profession, eliminating the need for alts unless you want to create characters from various races. You also have several slots for saving your various professions and equipment setups, which you can switch to and from quite easily. For more social players, link shells and free companies are a great way to interact with other players. The combat itself might feel a bit slow for some, thanks to the 2.5 second global cooldown. At the same time, the pace makes fighting in Final Fantasy XIV a bit more strategic. Adding to the strategy is the ability to use cross-class skills such as attacks, heals, and buffs from other disciplines. This allows for a certain level of customization even among similar professions. Story-wise, although Final Fantasy XIV doesn't quite approach the excellence of the more memorable Final Fantasy games, it's still better than what you get from many other MMOs. Although Final Fantasy does several things well, however, it also has its share of downsides. One is leveling up, which can be a pain when you run out of quests. This isn't a big issue with your main discipline, but can be a huge chore once you start leveling out other jobs, especially if you went gung-ho in finishing side quests with your first profession. Another is the scarcity of money in the game, particularly if you don't invest time in crafting. This can be an issue for high-level characters who, at one point, were actually losing more money from gear repairs than they were earning in tough runs. Square Enix recently did try to address this issue by lowering repair costs, as well as prices for dark matter, which is used in fixing gear. There's also the relatively high cost for travel, including airships, ferries, and the oh-so-convenient teleport. Travel may not be a big deal for players who like the immersion of manually traversing fields themselves. But if you're the type of player who hates traveling from one corner of the continent to another for the gajillionth time, not even your adorable Chocobo or your personal version of Shadowfax will ease the pain after being told by an NPC that you need to travel clear across Eorza to progress the story right after you just dragged your tired carcass from a long trip through the woods. Lack of inventory sorting can also be annoying, though a patch is apparently in the works for this. For PS3 users, While the controller does a surprisingly good job overall, navigating menus and targeting enemies within a group is also more cumbersome compared to a mouse and keyboard setup. Despite its downsides, I think the good parts of Final Fantasy certainly outweigh the bad. As I mentioned previously, the game strikes a nice balance between being accessible to both newcomers and hardcore players. And for fans of the modern Final Fantasy universe, the game is a great way to experience it in MMO form. Ultimately, Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn, isn't revolutionary. What it is, however, is a very polished rendition of the MMORPG formula. You can even say that it's one of the best representations of the genre to date.